it's an amazing relationship. I'm really blown away. I wish they could come to every meeting that I go to.
Well, hi, and thanks for joining us on Microsoft ISV Chat. Today, we're talking to the team from Cortex again, but this time talking about their technical challenges and what they faced going into the cloud. Joining us is CTO AK and the head of engineering, Sajiwa. Guys, thanks so much for taking the time to chat to us.
Thanks, Luke.
Hello. Now, most tech firms that have a large code base are always nervous to make the transition to the cloud. How did Cortex take their first step to do this?
Yeah, so thanks, Luke. For Cortex, we have not just only a large code base, it's also our code base transcends from hardware to firmware kind of stuff. Then you talk about the backend services, then you start going into the UI, mobile, or web. So that kind of a large problem domain when it comes to moving that workload into the cloud. So what we did was to have a very, very pragmatic approach. We just went down back to the drawing board and say, what is our biggest pain point? And what we discovered it was to do with our data pipeline. It was due to scale. We were finding it hard to scale out services. So all we could do was just to keep on adding and scaling up and adding more VM, adding more CPU, more memory, blah, blah, blah. But again, it wasn't helpful because we were doing a step scale. And when we need the scale, we don't have it. So we always have a downtime to do a scale. Again, our customers' demand was always, we need this service to be always on. So it is not it's not a non-essential service. We sit at the heart of our customers' businesses. So what we did was, how do we scale? That was our first step. Then we looked into what is preventing us from scaling. The first thing we saw was that in our code base, we had quite a lot of in-memory caches, right? So we have all this list objects that we had to kind of walk around. Then what we did was to move all those workload to a Redis cache implementation in Azure. So that was the first step. And that was very transparent to our users. As the first guiding principle that we laid out for engineers and for everyone is do no harm to the customer. So we had to still maintain everything else that we did. Also, we maintained a way back. So anything we do, we always have a switch or a configuration that allows us to roll back to the previous state. A little bit slower to do that, but again, we do not want to do any harm to our customer base. So our first step was to look at how do we scale, and that took us the journey of first, get out all the in-memory cache. Then we went to the next step of how do we get a more robust, scalable data pipeline. So we took all our messaging pipeline from devising to the cloud or to our host and back. We move all that workload parallelly to Azure Service Bus. So those were the two main decisions we made earlier in the journey of our transformation from on-prem to the cloud. And that has been a massive success for us.
Yeah, that's great. Sajiwa, we'll come to you. Tell us about how Microsoft Azure has supported this innovation capacity.
So I think one of the big advantages we had with Azure is that our tech stack was Microsoft to begin with. So all of our developers are already familiar with the tools and the technologies that are there. And when we leverage Microsoft Azure, the transition was fairly straightforward. In terms of integration with development tools, in terms of the debugging and analytics and insight capacity that Azure had, it was a very, very straightforward from a technology perspective to the transformation. On top of that level of integration, what we found was the concepts, the code bases that are supported on Azure was very much aligned with what we were already doing. So it made that jump a lot easier than it would have been if you went to a kind of a platform agnostic cloud provider.
I mean, how did your development process have to change to support that?
So one of the big changes was the change in mindset, right? So if you're coming from a background where you've written on-prem or you're used to on-prem devices, on-prem software, the developer mindset is always to continue to work in that way. There's a common kind of thinking that most developers will imitate or reimagine what they already see in the code base. So you have to have a shift in mindset to say, let's not redo something just because it's been implemented the same way before. And a good example of that is we had in our previous solution a lot of WCF services. And when it comes to implementing a new integration with an external provider or a completely separate service, the automatic feeling for most developers is to just re-implement them as WCF services. So having to think about, can we leverage Azure Functions? Can we leverage more of the PaaS offerings on Azure and redo that? Was a change in mindset, right? So that involved obviously a fair bit of training. We needed to have thought leaders within the organization, beyond the kind of management level, within the teams who could embrace cloud and then spread that knowledge to the team. Also, being on a cloud environment meant that our SDLC could be improved a lot. So we could leverage a lot more on our CI/CD environments. We could do a lot more infrastructure as code, which is actually a key point in not kind of learning from our mistakes, I guess, where in the past, if you configured a networking environment, you would have individuals who have that knowledge in their heads, and moving that to ISC and having your infrastructure in code meant that we could deploy instances for development, instances for QA, as well as production that were consistent. So that enabled us to do a lot more tighter CI/CD integration as well.
Yeah, I'd love to hear about how this has been implemented practically. I mean, tell us about one of your more recent projects.
So I guess the most recent transformation was, as AK mentioned a while ago, around transforming to Service Fabric. So in the past, all of the advancements we did to move to Service Bus, to decouple our services, we were still running our workloads on VMs. And what that meant was our scaling was a step change, right? So you'd have a certain amount of capacity, and then to go to the next level, you had to do a step increase. And that's not really economically viable. So the move to Service Fabric was a way for us to be able to dynamically scale or scale elastically the compute capacity behind our services. So what we did there was to have a look at our existing environments. And as AK mentioned, one of the key points was to make sure we don't disrupt our customers. So how do we implement a new cloud solution using Service Fabric while still maintaining our legacy platforms from the same code base? So we engaged with Microsoft Fast Track quite early on, and they helped us with the high-level architecture design to begin with, to find ways where we could encapsulate our services so they could run both on our VM infrastructure as well as Service Fabric. And that was a very big win. It meant that we didn't diverge our code base. And then we also leveraged Microsoft Fast Track quite a lot in getting into the details of how we would architect our Service Fabric clusters and how we would work with the integration with our legacy environments. And we've had a lot of success there, not just from a architectural level, but also from being able to engage with some of the actual Azure platform engineers back in the States to help us diagnose and uncover bottlenecks in our system. And that's been quite a good experience working with Microsoft on that.
Explain to me more about Fast Track. I mean, when you say that, what do you mean?
So the Microsoft Fast Track team is a team within Microsoft that helps ISVs like ourselves to get, as the name suggests, fast track our technical implementation. So there are multiple levels to that. When we initially engaged with the team, it was at that architectural level. This was to have a look at kind of what we would do from a big box environment perspective. Then when it gets to implementation detail, it goes into a much more deeper engagement. So we have today weekly calls with the engineering team at Microsoft. We've had them come into our office, sit down with our engineers on a whiteboard, go through our implementation, and in some cases going down to lines of code. We had one of the engineers from Redmond actually go through each line of our configuration for Service Fabric to help get us more performance out of that. So it's been a essentially top to bottom integration at a very good deep level from the team.
Yeah, that's great. We'll come to you, AK, again. How would you describe the architectural principles that you've started developing or adopting as a firm?
Yeah, so I think the very first thing for us is, how do you design solutions for the cloud or for being in the cloud? And it's you almost think about it as a skinny or naked consumption. you don't want to be thinking about infrastructure. You don't want to be thinking about, oh, how do I manage my login? And I want to have some file system and all the things that we're kind of used to doing, which is kind of VM thinking. So our principle is use the best service for the best job. So whether you are using Service Bus before doesn't mean that your next workload should always be on Service Bus. Maybe you want to go into something else. And what you want to do as well is that you want to contain the change in a very easy to govern way. So what do I mean by that? You have all this new resource group and you have all this nomenclature in Azure. That's a little bit overwhelming for developers sometimes, especially when they're starting out first on Azure. And what happened with us is that we see that the giving people access to our cloud subscription meant that they were sometimes try and error. And you can see that sometimes either whether it's security or cost, you kind of have an impact if you don't manage that governance properly. The other side to this principle is that we don't only run Microsoft tech stack on Azure. We run things like Node.js. We have a fully scaled out, fully deployed mobile backend solution for our Cortex Drive platform, which runs on AKS clusters. So Azure Kubernetes. And that is entirely different from our 360 .NET heavy SQL backed solution. So you have, on one hand, you have native Microsoft running on Azure. On the other hand, we also have Android, Node.js backend services to MongoDB all running on AKS. And being able to bring all those hybrid stuff in a single provider has been a very important thing to us. So we are leveraging of technology and also learnings from different areas to kind of improve our rate of innovation. And that has been very, very useful for us.
So Jiwa, what AK is describing sounds quite complex from a development perspective. How did you do this? I mean, what actually happened?
Yeah, so from a development perspective, I think the biggest challenge was, as I mentioned before, getting engineers on that journey. So we had to, first of all, look at training. So we partnered with Microsoft. They've actually trained all of our engineers now on Azure Fundamentals as a starting point, and are progressing through the different role-based accreditation as well. And that's quite important to understand the point that AK made around governance, where sometimes if you don't know the basics, if you don't know the details behind what you're doing, you could easily go and make changes or set up environments that are not aligned with actually what the customer's trying to do. So a good example of that is we had an engineer recently who enabled the Cosmos DB instance with 10,000 RUs for dealing with a small installation app. And that was a mistake they made because they didn't know the consequence of that, right? So that was one part was the training part. And the next was to make sure that with the governance around usage to understand where our bottlenecks are. So this is making sure we have monitoring put in place for these cloud services that they're using, especially the PaaS offerings in Microsoft, such as Service Bus, such as Cosmos DB is a good example. All of these resources that can scale at will, making sure we have a good handle on what those are doing as well, so that we can manage that.
It sounds like you need to ingest huge amounts of IoT data from the vast fleet of vehicles that your software monitors. I mean, what sort of challenges did you face designing the services to support those volumes?
So the biggest point around that was scalability. So scalability horizontally and scalability in terms of elastic scalability. So with one of the biggest constraints we had in the past was around the VMs. So being restricted to running on VMs meant that you're always either trying to add them in bulk, one at a time, or you're trying to scale them up, right? So one of the things we did was making sure you remove state from the services. So once your services are stateless, you can scale them horizontally. That was a key point. And as I mentioned before, around using Redis cache to enable that was an easy win for us. The other part was looking at platform services such as Azure Functions and AKS to be able to move workloads out from being services on VMs to be containers or serverless implementations. And that step is not as straightforward. That requires usually a bit of re-engineering, but usually it pays off on the long term as well. The other challenge is around data. So database being usually the constraint for most of these things, having a look at how you manage your data pipes and how you manage your hot and cold data separately. So moving your cold data to things like data lakes and doing your processing on that, and not relying on keeping all this volume of data as hot data in a SQL database. That's not something we'd want to be able to do. So those are some of the strategies we've done, and it's actually a path where you grow and you learn, and you kind of you have to be constantly evolving your platform to be able to handle that, because you don't want to be over engineering a solution that's not really relevant today, but you want to be able to make use of the right technology at the right time.
What was your team's experience like in building using these new technologies, and are there any that you kind of do differently?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that we found is as the team were learning Azure and learning kind of the details of it, mistakes were made, right? You think that you can read a documentation and understand how things work, but there's a lot of experience behind understanding some of these technologies. So we've had, for example, engineers that were using app service plans for Azure functions as if they were VMs. So fixed scale, completely taking away from the advantage of writing Azure functions. We've had people treating cloud native solutions as if they were VMs. So Service Fabric, for example, avoiding kind of thinking about those as what they were used to think about before. So one of the advantages we've had partnering with Microsoft is being able to have that sounding board through their team to ask these questions early and not actually make those mistakes ourselves. So that's been a learning for us, is don't jump in and don't try to do something without actually understanding how they work. Things on the surface seemed easy, and I think a lot of the cloud providers make it very easy for your amateur developer to get into the cloud, but it also has the danger of putting commercial workloads on there without thinking through the implications. So make sure you sound your ideas off the experts. Make sure you get in touch with people like Azure Fast Track, which is I think something I can recommend.
Yeah, just to add to that, Saj, from my experience is you need to understand your workload. Most people don't. Most people just go online, they read the documentation, and they jump into implementation. But you need to understand your workload. You also need to understand the intention of Microsoft for each of these resources. So that's kind of one thing I was just kind of a sounding alarm is when I see people just gravitate towards the new thing. It's very important that you stay innovative. It's very important that you keep learning. But if you don't understand your workload, and if you don't understand the need and the reason why Microsoft invented this resource that you're using, you're going to be caught out either paying too much or using the wrong tool for the job. And that's not what you want. The other part of that is the rapid pace of Azure evolution. So when we started, for example, in Azure Functions, it was one thing. We deployed a solution for production in a few weeks, and everybody was happy. But when you moved on in a few months, Azure's released 1 and 2 revisions to that. And so one has to be very aware of these evolutions and see how they kind of help you. So you can't just stop. So the message is you can't just stop. You can't say, oh, I've used Service Bus, I've used Azure Function, I've done some, what's it called, data lake. You just need to keep out for what is changing and why. So as Microsoft optimize, you need to also optimize, unless you just fall behind.
It sounds like there's been so much exciting development in terms of software, but in terms of hardware, what are you guys excited about and what can you share with us?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Look, we are not just a software firm, we also build hardware. So from PCB to electronics, PCBA, mechanical, industrial design, we do it all, and we do it here in Cortex. So in the last 12 months, our goal is to simplify the business. Over the last decades, all the entities that we talked about earlier on, we came together and we had more than 6 different hardware offerings. whether they're installed or we're still supporting it or they're end of life. What we were looking at is how do we consolidate these different technologies into one? And how do we have something that kind of not only suffice the needs of our customers now, but also is future proof? So the last 12 months has been us building the next gen tech, and we call it the Core Things platform, which includes the Core Hub, our edge device. So this is the Core Hub. So this is an Azure IoT certified device. It's very powerful. It does quite a lot more than what we've done in the past. And part of the ecosystem I mentioned earlier about building a vehicle area network is also having things like sensors that we've built. And these sensors are all talking with Bluetooth Low Energy, wirelessly connecting to the hub. So this has transformed the way we instrument our customers' assets, whether it's a warehouse or a distribution center or the actual truck itself, or the trailer behind the truck. All that stuff means now that we are going deeper, looking for that gold nugget when it comes to data and getting all these different data sources together in the hub as an edge device to provide that meaningful, accurate business insight to our customers.
Let's come to you, Sajeewa. What's next on the Cortex technical journey? You've obviously got to be willing to share it, though. I'm sure there's some secrets that you might not want to disclose.
Yeah, of course. I mean, at a high level, what we are doing is modernizing our platform across from the hardware perspective, from the software perspective, and from our user interface perspective on the different products we have. So it's been it's a journey, and I wouldn't say there's an end in mind. What we're looking at modernizing is both from removing the complexity of our user interface and complexities around how customers use our products, as well as from a technology perspective, being more cloud native and moving away from the legacy decisions we've had to make in the past. And that's really a never-ending journey, and it's a constant evolution of our platform. So that's what we're going to focus on, and that's what's going to kind of be driving us over the next few months.
Are you there yet as Cortex? Have you achieved what you set out to?
I think we are there. We are there from our mindset shift. We are definitely looking at the right things now, and we are definitely moving in the right direction. But there's never a end, right? It's a journey, and it's a journey where evolution of the technology and evolution of how you think has to happen. And we've got the mindset now to do that. So it's an exciting time.
Are there any technical learnings that you'd like to share with other ISVs who might be embarking on a tech change themselves?
Yep. So first of all, don't be scared. Be very pragmatic about your approach. Don't get caught out in the lift and shift concept of cloud. To me, that is not being in the cloud. That is still just hosting your workload in a VM. You can do it anywhere else. If you actually want to be in the cloud, be committed to the end. And even though there's no end, but it's very important that you have a growth mindset of this is not something that we just do one time and we stop. This is something that we keep investing in. And what it does for you is it allows you to understand the evolution and ask the question to Microsoft. Make sure you understand their roadmap. Ask them the question, is this service going to still be there next year? Are you guys thinking about changing it out? Is something better coming up? Because you don't want to be caught out in a scenario where you invest all your time, then you get to the end, you have a big red button and you want to go live, and Microsoft tells you, oh, that is no longer best practice. That happens a lot in cloud. So one thing we've seen in the last 5 years, for example, here is that at the beginning, there was this feature parity war going on, AWS, Azure, and now we have Google. But now Azure Cloud is very mature and they have their own roadmap, and it's very clear what they're setting out to do and how they differentiate themselves from the competition. Again, don't get me wrong, I'm not comparing clouds here, but my point is you are coming into a matured cloud that knows their stuff. And you need to be asking them about what are they thinking to do next, so you can align your development practices and even your roadmap to that of Microsoft.
That's awesome. So nice to talk to you guys. Thank you so much for your time, AK and Sajiwa from Cortex. Thanks so much.